Hi, welcome to our presentation of STAR, Noisy Semi-Supervised Transfer Learning for Visual Classification, which is a joint project of Concordia University and Decathlon in Montreal, Canada, which was supported by MyTax. To begin, we start by motivating, where we talk about the problem and discuss related work. We then describe our proposed method in detail. We also show experiment results with comparison to recent approaches, as well as conduct ablation and robustness studies. Finally, we end with conclusion. Visual classification models can automatically assign tags to images and can aid in data-driven sport analytics. However, these models are not perfect. A major issue impacting their use is the availability of large-scale labeled datasets which are required to train these models. While unlabeled data can be generally obtained with minimal human labor, labeling data is often laborious, costly, and requires the efforts of experienced human annotators. There is a pressing need to build models which can effectively use large volumes of unlabeled data. Semi-supervised learning addresses this issue by leveraging large collections of unlabeled data together with a relatively small amount of labeled data with the goal to learn better visual classifiers. Generally, this follows a teacher-student paradigm by training on the labeled data to get an initial teacher model. Then, the teacher model is used to generate pseudo-labels for the unlabeled data. Finally, a student model is trained from scratch on the combined labeled and pseudo-labeled data. While this method solves the problem of using unlabeled data to improve vision models, it requires data on a scale of billions to work well. In their work, they generated pseudo-labels on a collection of 300 million images. This becomes infeasible for tasks where the scale of unlabeled data is much smaller. Further, the teacher and student models are trained from scratch, which require longer runtime and larger memory. Our approach integrates transfer learning and self-training with Noisy Student into a single framework with the goal of improving visual classification performance and reducing computation overhead. The input is a set of labeled and unlabeled images for a particular visual classification task. The goal is to use the labeled and unlabeled data for the underlying task. A supervised learning model called Teacher, which has been pre-trained on ImageNet, is trained on the labeled images by minimizing the cross-entropy loss. Then, the teacher model is used to generate pseudo-labels for the unlabeled data. Using both the labeled and pseudo-labeled data, a larger pre-trained model called Student is trained. During this training process, data augmentation and dropout are used as a form of input noise and model noise. We use data augmentation and dropout as a form of noise when training the student models. We create modified versions of the input images in a dataset through random transformations. Data augmentation enforces the student model to make consistent predictions across augmented versions of an image. While the teacher model generates pseudo-labels for clean images, the student model is trained to predict those labels for an augmented image as input. In other words, the student model is forced to retain the same category for the augmented image as the original image. Dropout can be viewed as a way of regularizing a deep neural network by adding noise to its hidden units. When using dropout, the layer drops the neuron connection with a certain probability. In our case, we make this probability 50%. This makes the teacher model like an ensemble of models when generating pseudo-labels. Applying input noise and model noise to the unlabeled data enables the student model to treat the labeled and unlabeled data as a single distribution. We consider 3 use cases. We are interested in building models to identify whether a given image displays people practicing sports, the kind of sport, as well as identify the pose from a pool of popular yoga poses. We put our method to the test on 3 datasets for both binary and multi-class image classification. For sport or not and sport classification tasks, we use the UNLB 700 dataset. For yoga pose classification tasks, we use the UNLB 120 dataset. We compare our method against recent supervised and semi-supervised learning models. While noisy student training is a semi-supervised learning method and requires both labeled and unlabeled data, EfficientNet is a supervised learning model and requires only labeled data. In this case, we train EfficientNet on the labeled data and use that for comparison. Here is a subset of the experiments we performed. For all tasks, our method outperforms the previous approaches. We can also see a relative improvement of around 21% for the sport classification task, which has a total of 155 classes. We find that our method has significant performance improvements in multi-class classification settings. The top figure shows the performance on the yoga pose validation set, and we can see that STAR outperforms the teacher model by a large margin on classes such as camel, chair, standing forward bend, warrior 1 and wheel. We only see a drop in performance for the child and twist classes. In the bottom figure, the performance on the test set is shown. We notice the largest improvement using STAR is seen for the Cobra class with a F1 score of 100%, whereas the supervised model has a score of 50%. For the majority of the classes, a significant improvement is obtained using our method compared to baselines. Here we show experiments for training time and memory requirements with and without transfer learning while training student models. Our approach reduces training time and computation overhead by significantly reducing the number of learnable parameters. We believe that our approach is more practical for the industrial perspective in the sense that we can quickly develop models that can leverage unlabeled data in a semi-supervised fashion. We vary the amount of true labels while training semi-supervised learning models. We show that even with few label samples, our method can effectively use unlabeled data to achieve better performance for the desired task. We also find that while there is a drop in performance in our method when the amount of labeled data reduces, it is actually higher than when the baseline uses all available labeled data for training. We study how the number of pseudo-labels generated from the unlabeled samples can affect classification performance in self-training. On the left, we can see that the number of pseudo-labels grow. The performance shows an increasing trend, which suggests that adding more pseudo-labels would potentially improve performance since the trend has not saturated. On the right, we can see how thresholding affects performance. A threshold of 0.7 means that if the predicted label is below such a threshold, it is discarded from the pseudo-label dataset. Notice an upward trend when decreasing the threshold. This trend can be attributed to the fact that even though increasing the threshold may lead to higher quality pseudo-label data, more images are being discarded, resulting in a drop in performance. We find that using all available pseudo-labels work better compared to using thresholding, which is also in line with findings from previous work. Here we plot the raw probability scores by the teacher model on the unlabeled images used for yoga pose classification task. The plot shows that most of the pseudo-labels have high confidence due to a good teacher model. This is also attributed to the fact that the unlabeled images are acquired using search keywords or labels, which we ignored and treated them as unlabeled data. Hence, these images are somewhat relevant and not considered out of domain for the given task. And leaving relevant images out would degrade performance, as shown in the previous slide. Evaluating for adversarial robustness is important to understand how different models will generalize in new tasks. One approach to do this is to study their performance on adversarial perturbations. We use the white box attack FGSM to convert the input image to an adversarial image and then feed it to the models with the goal of ensuring a misclassification. For a given input image, the method uses the gradient of the loss function with respect to the input image to create a new image that maximizes the loss with the update on each pixel. The new image is called the adversarial image. We find that our method improves adversarial robustness even though no optimization is done for this task. Across all visual classification tasks, our method is better compared to other previous approaches. In yoga pose classification, we observed the highest improvement. To conclude, STAR works pretty well at using unlabeled data on a scale of thousands. It also outperforms recent state-of-the-art semi-supervised learning method, especially in multi-class classification settings. It is also efficient both in terms of runtime and memory. STAR is also more robust to adversarial attacks. Thanks for listening. We provide the source code as well as the demo in the following links.